You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show with K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen talking about the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you.
Roger, what is the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System?
Well, that's a good question. It's part of the Clean Water Act, and more specifically, the Clean Water Act amendments of 1972. And in a nutshell, the federal government has said that if you're going to discharge a pollutant, and that's a specifically defined term, it's got a little bit broader application than one would normally think when we refer to the term pollutant. But if you're going to discharge a pollutant into the navigable waters of the United States, so into a WOTUS, you have to have a permit. And that's what this system is, the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System. It's an NPDES permit. I have to have a federal permit. Is
there a part of agriculture that's almost exempt from this?
Yeah, there's a big exemption for ag irrigation return flows. So irrigation return flows are exempt in agriculture from the permit requirement. And you can discharge into groundwater even if it's hydrologically connected to surface water without a permit.
And there are a couple of cases that go along with this, and one of them being a 2020 case.
Yeah, that was a 2020 U.S. Supreme Court decision involving the county of Maui in Hawaii. And what the court said there was, and I won't belabor the facts of that case, but they came up with a multi-factor test, a 7-factor test to determine whether an indirect discharge is really a direct discharge, which would require a permit. And that involved, I'll mention the facts a little bit, involved a wastewater treatment facility on Maui. And they would treat the water before it would go into, they'd treat sewage before it would go into the Pacific Ocean. Well, the question was, do they need a federal permit to do that? And the court set up a 7-factor test for determining whether you have to have a permit in those situations.
What are those different factors?
Well, what's the nature of the material through which the pollutant travels? That's one of those. What's the transit time? What's the distance that it's traveled? What's the extent to which the pollutant is diluted or chemically changed as it travels? And what's the amount of the pollutant that enters navigable waters relative to the amount of pollutant that leaves the point source? And, of course, the wastewater treatment facility is the point source in that case. Another one is the manner by or area in which the pollutant enters the navigable waters and the degree to which the pollution at that point has maintained its specific identity. Now, I think in most of these cases that we've seen since then, time and distance are the most important factors in most cases, but not necessarily every one.
In another case that plays into all of this, the Maryland case, and what is that case?
Well, in that case, and this is a recent decision right at the end of 2024, there was a town in Maryland that applied for a groundwater discharge permit from the Maryland Department of Environment for wastewater treatment facility that was going to dispose treated effluent through spray irrigation onto crop fields. And that permit had the effluent limitations in it. It also specified requirements for nutrient management plan and conditions to ensure that there would be complete uptake of the nutrients by vegetation, resulting in net zero discharge to groundwater or surface waters. And so that was all in the permit, and the permit allowed the use of spray irrigation to discharge up to 100,000 gallons of treated wastewater per day onto farm fields in the county. And, of course, they got their state permit there, and there was a group that challenged it and said, well, you need a federal permit too. And that was the battle. Do they need a federal permit or not? And to decide that, then the court looked, this Maryland Court of Appeals looked at what we call the Maui factors to determine whether they needed a federal permit. And based on that analysis, they said, no, you don't need one.
Why did the Maui factors not include into this, do we need a permit, do we not need a permit?
Well, the Maryland Department of Environment here, the court said, did things correctly. And they said that the record supported the state's findings and conclusions. They said the department determined the discharge was not the functional equivalent of a direct discharge to surface waters, and that was supported by substantial evidence because the state Environmental Department had already considered the Maui factors in determining whether there should be an additional federal permit. They went through the analysis, and the court said they went through that analysis as laid out by the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, entirely properly, and they provided a detailed factual basis for their conclusion. And they said there was a nutrient management plan that was included with the permit that would ensure 100% uptake of nutrients as state law required, and that was supported by the evidence. And so the evidence supported what the state was doing here, and they properly applied, the court said, the 7 factors that came out of the Supreme Court's Maui opinion. And so the court said, we're not going to change that. The state did its work here. The administrative agency did its work. We're not going to change that result. And so there was no federal NPDES permit that was required.
Is this something that you think is going to have more cases related to it in the future?
Well, in terms of its impact on ag irrigation activities, if there is an impact, that's where it would be, because that exemption is a big exemption for agriculture. And so the question has come up, well, will these cases impact that at all? And, initially the Maui case would have an impact because you'd have to analyze irrigation activities based on the 7 factors that the U.S. Supreme Court laid out. However, there have been a couple of developments since the 2020 opinion of the Supreme Court. One came down in 2023, May 25 of 2023, and that's the Sackett case. And we've talked about that. You and I have talked about the Sackett opinion. That's a WOTUS opinion, and it really narrows the scope of the application of the permit system to adjacent wetlands. And so that narrows the scope of a required permit. It narrows the application of the Maui factors in certain situations. You'll have fewer cases that come up as a result of that. And then last year was the big Chevron decision, and we've talked about that on this program before, where the deference given to administrative agencies now is less. We use what's now known as Skidmore deference, and that is basically the courts are telling the administrative agencies, no, you're not the experts on construing what statutory language means. We are. That's the court's job. And so the agencies get much less deference. And I think when you put Sackett and Chevron together, since the Maui opinion came out in 2020, you're going to have fewer situations where the ag irrigation return flow exemption would be questioned.
Is there anything you recommend that agricultural operations maybe take the time to take a look at, implement, or understand what they're doing?
Well, common sense always goes a long ways. And I think anytime you can use more efficient irrigation systems to minimize runoff and ensure that water is used more effectively, that's a good idea. And that could include drip irrigation or soil moisture sensors or any other technologies that reduce water waste. And then also establish buffer zones and vegetation around water bodies, if you can, to help filter things out before they reach navigable waters. And adopt nutrient management practices to help prevent excess fertilizers from entering water bodies, including the use of precision agriculture techniques that apply fertilizers more accurately and efficiently. And then in areas of the country where it's possible, and some places in Kansas it's not, and some areas as you get further north it's not, but plant a cover crop to reduce soil erosion and runoff and improve soil health. All of those things, if you fit them in your overall management plan for your farm, can help minimize issues where the courts would get involved.
Is this something you're keeping an eye on as we look forward?
It is. This was an important case that came out of Maryland. Again, I think we'll see fewer and fewer of these cases, and I think that ag irrigation return flow exemption is pretty solid.
So, Roger, as we sum up these different cases in the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, what are really the key points of things that could impact agriculture or people using water? Well,
keep in mind the NPDES, the federal permit system, only applies to point source discharges. That's usually not a problem for agriculture because agriculture is dealing with diffuse surface runoff. So often we don't have point source pollutants. However, if you have a situation where perhaps you're irrigating, it gets into a grass waterway, and from that grass waterway the water collects and goes into a navigable water, and we don't have too many of those in Kansas, but let's say it's the Kansas River or it's the Missouri River. Those are a couple of them that come to mind. Then you could have the potential for the application of an NPDES permit. Then you've got the irrigation return flow exemption. Okay, so you have to layer that on top. Ag has an exemption for irrigation return flows that might apply. Well, in this instance, that was at issue in this case, and then you would apply the Maui factors, but with, again, the opinions by the Supreme Court subsequent to that case in 23 and 24, I think you'll have much less interaction of the law with respect to irrigation activities for agriculture. I think that's the main point.
If people want to read more on this topic or other topics related to agricultural law or taxation, how can they do that?
They can find that on Ag Manager through the Ag Econ Department at K-State.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was Kansas State University and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. If you'd like to read more on this topic, one way you can do that is by checking out his recent blog article titled Agriculture's Irrigation Return Flow Exemption. I will link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can also find it by going to K-State's agricultural economics website, agmanager.info. Again, that is agmanager.info. If you'd like to find other work from Roger, you can do so by going to the agmanager.info website, clicking on contributors, and then clicking on Roger McEowen.